It's privatization!
Great, so it's kind of chilly today, but it's a good place to hang out, right?
Yeah.
Definitely.
Okay, great.
Beautiful orca here.
Yeah, it's
you're
awesome.
right.
I wonder who put it here.
Yeah, who put it here?
Yeah.
Oh,
I
think-
wonder who owns this space.
Oh my
Well,
god.
there seems to be a cone here with
Yeah.
Victoria City written on it. Do you think Victoria owns this space?
I guess so.
But we're here.
Yeah.
Oh my god, do you think that it's a private space? Like somebody own it, like for his own interest?
But the city of Victoria is made up of people like us
Okay.
that live in it.
Yeah, so
So-
technically it's public.
Yeah.
But what makes up?
What makes up private space?
Yeah, if it's public.
What is property?
What is, yeah.
Leslie, can you tell us?
A large public sector is beneficial from the CMES. It means coordinated market economics. And however, the more integrated and public economic into world trade, less beneficial a large public sector is. If an economy is highly integrated into world trade, then the relationship is gonna be reverses, and a large public sectors is gonna be like impact from competitiveness of export or manufacturing. The privatization, as it has emerged in public discussion, is not one clear and absolute economic proposition. Rather, it covers a wide range of different activities, all of which imply a transfer of provision of goods and the service from a public to the private sectors. For example, privatization covers the sale of public goods or something else to the private owners. Sometimes they want to stop the government program and the contracting of the service formerly provided by state organizations to private producers. And the entry of private producers into the market, they were formerly public monopolized. Privatization also means different things in different parts of the world, whether both fundamentals of the economy and the purpose served by privatization may differ.
We'll be talking about the way that public space is privatized in an institutionalized manner. So I will be using parks as my example. So when I was looking on the City of Victoria website, I was unable to find a definition of public space, and I thought that this was interesting because they talk about public space so much, but it's kind of assumed what it means. So was able to find, I'm from Kelowna, and I was able to find the definition of public space from the City of Kelowna, which was public space means any real property or portions of real property owned or leased by the city to which the public is ordinarily invited or permitted to be in or on, and includes but is not necessarily limited to the grounds of public facilities or buildings, the surface of Okanagan Lake and the lake foreshore, and any public transit exchange, transit shelter or bus stop, and public parkades or parking lots. And it didn't exactly mention parks either, so that's a little confusing. And while the City of Victoria did not have definition of public space, it did have a definition of what private parks were, which is also an interesting thing. So I will use parks as an example of public space in Victoria. The section in the Victoria City bylaws related to parks extensively explains what is and what is not permitted for residents to do when using public parks. Many activities are allowed, but only with permission from the city. For example, to play any sort of game, have any sort of meeting, and hand out any types of flyers, one must gain permission from the city. So according to bylaw 4C, in order to have a parade, march, or even a group meeting for this project in a public park, we would technically need permission from the city, and we would need to have a comprehensive insurance of $2 million. So now this is not generally enforced, but it is a bylaw that they do have. And so I find that this policy is really exclusive to who is allowed to use public parks legally. And according to bylaw 13, it is illegal to remove a tree, plant, flower, seed, shrub from a public park. So while the park is public, all the nature within it is privatized. The amount that parks are regulated and is in a sense privatized seems contrary to the belief that they are public. The way in which they are used, when they are used, and by whom they are used is very controlled. Parks are only one example of the way that public spaces are controlled by an institution like a city and are made more private due to the extreme regulations put upon space.
Are in link with property. Okay? Let's do it, yeah! We are going to talk about property and like what is going on in this city and where there is a lot of homeless people and where there is a lot of rich people and wow! It's great. Here we go, we have a kind of symbol about the monopoly and like the property and this idea of have a big house and have renter and stuff like this. And I think it's a good symbol, and it's very interesting to find that in front of a McDonald's, which is a fucking good example of architecture against homelessness in the city, because they use this speaker here in order to project, like to produce ultrasound in order to put homeless people away. Because when you are eating your fucking Big Mac, you don't want to see homeless people just in front of you, because it's disgusting, right? So, thanks to McDonald's, we have this good ultrasound weapon. It can be interesting to define homelessness. I think that it's a spectrum of accommodation need, including no housing situation, or roofing, sleeping, or maybe housing crisis. And it can be visible as street people or invisible as people living in their car. And we have some example of students who are living in their car in UVic and in Commons College because they can't afford student fees and rent. I would like to highlight that Victoria accommodation situation. It's very expensive to live here, so there is kind of gentrification in downtown and in Oak Bay area, like rich people can afford this kind of place, and there is indirect exclusions, displacement of poor people by rent spike. So this is a fact in a lot of cities, but most of the city have gentrification place, but also low-income rent, and we have no low-income market in Victoria. Victoria does not have a low-income housing market. The capitalist mode of providing housing as a community is not capable of providing affordable, adequate places to live for people who depend on income assistance in Victoria. Like I said, there is territorial consequences of that. People are living in the street and in public space, and they can like be in the park between 8 p.m. and 7 a.m. I think that we can say that the concept of property is like producing exclusion, and we should challenge the government and the actual capitalist economy to think like about shifting. It doesn't work, you know. Like everybody is not happy in our society. It's maybe a kind of utopia, but we can do better than that. You know, we can think about other economic system, and we can act with an anarchist perspective and think about mutual aid and reciprocity in order to improve our life. Yeah.
When talking about graffiti, we jump to the conclusion that it's negative and it's to portray a negative scene, like obscenities or anything. Basically, we talk about it like we're waging a war, which is a lot of scholars have considered it as and talked about it as. Graffiti artists are very diverse, and this is something that's very misconstrued when we talk about it as a society as a whole. Not all writers are looking to express the same things. However, as a society, we're taught to see this as a public disorder that must be eradicated almost by any means possible. As we can see here, people are painting over it. This is due to or writers use both public and private property, and this is why it's happening, is because this property is probably privately owned. Therefore, their artwork and expressions must be eradicated. This is considered like their artwork is basically so that they can create a common ground amongst the entire society or city. In a sense, boundaries kind of don't exist, they're just social constructions, and claims to space are merely just socially constructed as well. Rather, artists use these platforms as an opportunity to communicate across various planes. So as opposed to owning something in order to express an idea or convey a message through ownership of space, lands, or even buildings, individual expressions done through graffiti are more fluid and seen as more invisible because we don't actually see the graffiti artist most of the times. Most of the time we just see the aftermath, which would be the product. And a lot of the times this is because graffiti artists, there is ongoing conflict with increasing privatization of space and being able to write anywhere. So they're basically not allowed to write anywhere, or they don't want to be caught writing somewhere because this act is seen as uncontrollable. In other words, graffiti is a way of taking out the relational power that comes along with the notion of territory, such as established boundaries, and truly incorporating discourse into the landscape rather than owning something. The private sector has been continually increasing in order to have more control over members of society, such as those who write, because those who write, such as graffiti artists, are uncontrollable members of society who cannot conform to the social norm that the state basically enforces. This includes, and is not limited to, privatization through structures such as enforcing fences, even barbed wire fences, and it's considered like a war on graffiti over many decades, and this has basically led to a booming surveillance industry that thus increasing privatization of space to maintain control.
Davie Village refers to the stretch of Davie Street between Burrard and Jervis Streets in Vancouver, BC. It is known internationally for its thriving community of gay and lesbian residents. The streets are lined in visual symbolism of the LGBT community and inclusivity.
Takes place here, you may be wondering? I'll tell you now. A large part of Davie Village was created due to its location and natural amenities. During the 80s, St. Paul's Hospital, this building right here, became the center for excellence in HIV and AIDS research, thus drawing a larger amount of gay men to the area, as this was historically the demographic that HIV was most prominent in. As Jill Valentine writes, many lesbians and gay men conceal their sexualities so that they pass as heterosexuals in everyday situations. Due to this prejudice and stigma around homosexuality, people who are usually labeled as the other can come together and create their own community. Due to this, a diversity of queer folks was then drawn to this location. Over time, Davie Street Village was created. Valentine, when I say that this place, with a concentration of gay businesses and leisure activities, can offer a resource for lesbians and gay men to live, work, find support and companionship and sexual partners. In doing so, this area does not put the same amount of effort into creating these amenities for heterosexual individuals. Does creating a community also inherently create another? Doreen Massey, a scholar who wrote the book For Space, defines place as a negative concept. She explains that it is closed and coherent, hostile, and creates alienating webs. While I'm in Davie Village, I'm included in the village and feel a sense of belonging. Whereas on the other side, my identity may have me feeling left out and alienated. For outsiders to view this place is as a resource. Jamie Peck suggests that this place provides resources for its surrounding areas. He states that in order to maintain competitive economic revenue, cities must attract the new creative class, with hip neighborhoods, art scenes, and gay-friendly atmospheres. This idea is a new kind of capitalism based on human creativity, where economic revenue can be received by providing a place where outsiders can quickly become insiders. This would mean that the surrounding city capitalizes off privatization due to human identity and sense of belonging.
Pride parades and these inclusive shops do create an atmosphere not to be missed by tourists. This brings in revenue for the surrounding city. Thoughts?
As the others have discussed some of the many facets of privatization and the societal divisions that occur through land use, I am here to discuss the intersections of identities and how they pertain to the way that our society conducts privatized ownership, property rights, and how identities are organized through spatial means. So let's get walking. Leslie earlier explained privatization, which is a concept based out of neoliberal capitalism. Capitalism is a system built specifically on the power relations and the exclusion in order to maintain hegemonic control over minority groups. The way this concept pertains to the privatization of land is through the segregation of marginalized groups. The processes of racism and patriarchy create an environment in which designated people of power are able to exist freely, whereas others are limited to where they are able to exist and how they travel through space. This kind of restraint is largely enforced through economic means, largely through the devaluation of people of color. People of color are largely restricted to spaces that are deemed undesirable for people of privilege through economic, environmental, and political means. To give you a better idea, some examples that encapsulate the systematic racism that is instilled at the heart of privatization is the insertion of industrial districts and other pollutants in areas of minority residence, such as the attempt to build the Dakota Access Pipeline on Aboriginal land, or the ghettoization of people of color in urban areas where there are undesirable environmental conditions, such as the flooding and displacement that occurred in black neighborhoods after Hurricane Katrina. And also, policies of bank loans and property rights that actively work against people of color. Economically, differences in attitude towards perceived racial identities and gender inequality are similar in the sense that the privatization that occurs under neoliberal capitalism creates a landscape where the exploitation of culture can create enhanced profit for those who are in positions of power. This exploitation of identity occurs in similar ways to what Noelle has discussed with the LGBT community. But rather, racial inequality can be traced further into history of wealth, power, and poverty. The universal presence of racial wealth gap is organized into two categories: the racially discriminatory policies enforced by all the major capitalist institutions, including the labor markets, the educational system, which we can see behind us, and credit markets that work to hinder the ability for people of color to gain individual wealth. The history of systematic discrimination is the second category that limits racial wealth. It has existed since the end of slavery in order to maintain a controlling hand over people of color, and it creates an uneven starting point across the economic field depending on one's racial identity. How this discrimination intersects through space is via the process of land control. Thinking back on how we established land claims here in North America, we can see a large and ongoing history of colonial theft in order to maintain white profit, which is implemented by land practices that result in the unjust displacement of people of color. This is first put into action by racializing large bodies or groups and then normalizing whiteness to default status, thus enforcing a hierarchy based around white privilege and supremacy. This white advantage results in an unspoken white ownership and dominance of public space, allowing the white majority to control land usage and designate fields of existence for marginalized groups. This possession of space is solidified by the sense of entitlement and belonging that is attached to whiteness, in all forms, which also works to maintain power through the exclusion and subjugation of people of color by manifesting racial ideas within our perceptions of space. This internalized understanding of racial division is not something limited to people who can identify within whiteness or default labels. Much like one's whiteness does not directly mean one is an elitist or racist. But we must recognize that white supremacy as a function within our society of hierarchies benefits all white people simply through the participation of the global population in a system that upholds a racialized power structure. The benefits of white identity functions outside of the other aspects of identity, so regardless of one's economic status, sexuality, gender, or political beliefs, identifying as a white individual leads to a systematically enforced entitlement to many things. but specifically space, land, and property through the means of privatization. How we conduct ourselves on a daily basis is a reflection of the privilege and worth we have been assigned through our carefully crafted social hierarchies.
Bing, 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 bong, bing, 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 bong. Bing, 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 bong, bing, bing.